Well, hello, everyone. I'm Bert Covert, co-chair of the American Society of Primatologists Conservation Committee, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar titled Mining and Risk to Human Welfare and Biodiversity. I anticipate that you'll find this to be an interesting and an important event. We will have a question and answer session after our presentations. If you've got a question for our panelists, please submit through the question tab at the bottom of your screen. And if you want the question to go to a specific panelist, please say so. This webinar is being recorded and will be deposited on the American Society of Primatology Conservation videos page. And the recording will reside on our YouTube channel, AMSOC, Primatologists Conservation Committee. I also want to encourage you to consider making a cash donation to support conservation projects funded by the ASP Conservation Committee. And finally, I encourage you to become a member of the American Society of Primatologists if you're not one already. Again, I'm Bert Covert, co-chair of the ASP Conservation Committee and professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm honored to be moderating this event. I want to thank Marilyn Norncock, my co-chair of the ASP Conservation Committee and professor emeritus of anthropology at Kent State University, for planning this event. It wouldn't be happening without her dedicated efforts. I also want to thank Jennifer Kramer for her wonderful contributions to the virtual environment that's hosting this webinar. Jennifer is a primatologist and the program director for sociology, anthropology, and general studies at American Public University System. And now to introducing our speakers. Mundolini erkenswig Watsu is a scientist at the Institute for Conservation Research at San Diego Zoo Global. She's a PhD in biological anthropology from Washington University in St. Louis. Her research focuses on the application of frugal science in the field of conservation genomics in the Peruvian Amazon for wildlife disease and biodiversity monitoring programs. In addition, she works on population genomics monitoring programs for the Andean bear, Sumatra tiger, Indian and African leopard, and reticulate giraffe. Programs she manages emphasize capacity building, research training, and conservation education as the fundamental pillars of sustainable field biology. Our second speaker will be Kelly Boyer-Ontel. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at Ball State University. Her research focuses on the ecology and behavior of unhabituated chimpanzee groups in southeastern Senegal using indirect and non-invasive methods. Kelly's current work addresses the impacts of small-scale gold mining on chimpanzees and their habitat, as well as the chimpanzees' use of caves as microrefugia in the hot savanna environment. Her work in Senegal led her to establish the Fongoli Chimpanzee Conservation Project that promotes chimpanzee conservation through children's education programs in remote villages. She has an undergraduate degree from Franklin and Marshall College, and her MA and PhD are from Iowa State University. Ari Friesem is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Medical Sciences at the Anton de Kom University of Suriname and is research affiliate at the Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. He has an undergraduate degree in biology from Kent State University and a master's degree in anthropology from Kent State as well. His current research focuses on the presence of mercury in the environment of Suriname and the potential risks to women of reproductive age and young children through consumption of contaminated fish. Ari also works with the Association of Indigenous Village Leaders in Suriname, where he provides scientific education support on various issues such as mercury ecotoxicity and COVID-19. He is of indigenous descent and as such approaches life, work, research from the viewpoint that we need to respect nature, revere all that nature provides, and be responsible citizens in nature. Ari, you are now in charge.
Thank you, Bert. Quite the wonderful introductions. So welcome everyone from wherever you are in the world. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Welcome to our panel of talks on mining and risks to human welfare and biodiversity. I would like to thank once again ASP, especially the Conservation Committee, for organizing this, and for Bert for moderating, and for Jennifer Kramer for providing technical advice. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce or give the mic over to Mundolini, where she will talk about the Quicksilver Demon. The mic is now yours.
Thank you, Ari. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to begin. So thank you for having me speak at this webinar series. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I hope that you find the materials I'm going to talk about interesting, and I hope we have some lively discussion at the end of this. So in 1956, in the quiet seaside town of Minamata on the southwestern coast of Japan's Kyushu Island, cats began to behave really strangely. They convulsed, displayed excessive salivation, and finally they lost the ability to walk. Then birds began to fall out of the sky, dead. Shellfish opened and decomposed, and fish also displayed abnormal behaviors, eventually floating up to the surface of the Shiranui Sea. One day, humans too began to fall sick, reporting severe numbness of the limbs and the inability to speak or eat. It wasn't until 1959 that it was fully acknowledged that a disease was responsible for these phenomena. The deaths in the cats, birds, fish, and the humans were in fact all connected. In humans, it was termed Minamata disease, a debilitating and chronic condition caused by consuming fish poisoned by methyl mercury. Through a combination of dredging and nets at an expense of something like 48.5 billion yen, the bay was finally deemed safe to be fished in the 1990s. There have been many other poisoning incidents across the globe, the kind of catastrophes that gain media attention. But the large part of mercury pollution isn't from these kinds of accidents. It's from coal plants releasing mercury into the air, and it's also from artisanal and small-scale mining. Primarily, we're going to be talking about the mining of gold in this context. This is not at all a small industry. It involves nearly 20 million miners globally, including women and children. So why mine gold? And the simplest answer here is because there is a profitable market for it, because you and I buy gold. This is a bride from the region of southern India in which I grew up. Gold is intrinsic to our culture there. It plays a role in weddings, in inheritance, and as an alternate to banks. Gold is also the metal that is almost ubiquitous in nearly every wedding or engagement ring purchased in the United States or Europe. And there's no clean gold movement per se, not like, for example, with diamonds. After the recession in 2007, gold prices began to skyrocket, the red line here. Mercury, which is used to mine gold, also had higher prices in this period. That's the yellow curve you see in the inset. But the ratio of mercury to gold prices has always favored continued gold mining using mercury. And we can see that when the world is struggling financially, people tend to rely on gold more. So look at the curve in the last two global recessions, 2008 and 9, and in 2020 and 2021, and you can see how those prices go up. In 2013, the Minamata Convention on Mercury was adopted by 140 countries, and it entered into force in 2017. By 2018, all acetaldehyde production using mercury was phased out, and so began the slow but steady phasing out of a variety of commercial products that contain mercury. There are a great many reasons why some 20 million people choose to engage in gold mining. Many of them are complex and driven by the need for resources that are not otherwise available. Later in this webinar, we'll be diving into these human contexts more deeply. But in this talk, I'm going to focus on wildlife and how ASGM affects them. So mercury, contrary to commonly held beliefs, isn't with you for life. Your body does have a way to get rid of it in a process called demethylation, but it takes a great deal of time. Mercury can exist in forms of high or low toxicity. So forms with low toxicity can be transformed into forms with high toxicity through biological processes. The most toxic form is called methylmercury, and it's created when organisms uptake mercury from their environments. It can become bioconcentrated in organisms over time. So for example, the longer you are exposed to it, the more you will retain it. And this is a process called bioaccumulation. It can also become bioconcentrated over trophic levels or levels in a food chain. So for example, top predators will have higher amounts of mercury from it biomagnifying up the food chain. But what does it really do to wildlife? This is more well studied in the United States, where coal plants cause mercury to be released as an air pollutant, for example, than it is actually studied in South America. So we know that, for example, Carolina wrens with 1.2 parts per million of methyl mercury in their blood demonstrate a reduced nesting success of 20%. A review of 200 studies, that's the one you're looking at here, published in 2016, covered some 20,000 individual birds across 176 species. And it demonstrated that fish-eating and carnivorous birds had higher mercury levels than the herbivores. And 28% of them demonstrated moderately risky levels of mercury, about 8% had highly risky levels, and 4% had severely risky levels of mercury. So this is definitely a widespread problem. Today, I want to discuss a particular area of the world in which gold has been mined steadily for decades, with expansions occurring that mirror the increasing price of gold. This is Southeastern Peru in the Department of Madre de Dios, also one of the most biodiverse states in Peru and home to a remarkable array of wildlife. At the site where I've done most of my research, the Los Amigos Biological Field Station, there are some 567 species of birds, 11 species of monkeys, 6 cats, and literally thousands of insects, rodents, and marsupials. But ASGM has threatened these wildlife in some intrinsic and measurable ways, together with also endangering the health of the people in the area. On the left is an aerial view of what is left of forests in La Pampa, one of the biggest mining sites in the area. On the right, the monitoring of the Andes Amazon Project, or the MAAP program, uses publicly available satellite imagery to look for deforestation from an aerial point of view. They found that combined in 2017 and 2018, there were the highest 2-year deforestation levels total ever recorded. So 18,440 hectares of forest disappeared. That is the equivalent of 34,400 American football fields, and it happened in one region in just 2 years. It was at this time that my research team at Field Projects International began a large-scale wildlife surveillance program. Driven originally by the need to document normal parasite and pathogen loads in a range of wildlife, we quickly realized that we had an unprecedented opportunity here to look at mercury levels in a wide variety of taxa using the same standard methods at the same moment in time. So it was really exciting, and we took a team of close to 30 individuals, including many research trainees and veterinarians, to conduct this health screening program. During the program, we took fur or hair or feathers from standardized locations on each animal and then sent them for analysis to the Biodiversity Research Institute, to Dr. Dave Evers' laboratory, for reading on a DMA-AT. That's the machine that can actually quantify mercury. So we also DNA barcoded each animal directly in the rainforest at the Inca Terra Green Lab, which was the first molecular genetics laboratory in this portion of the Amazon. The results I'm presenting now are not published and are the first part of a comparative study, so they're necessarily more generalized in how they're depicted here. I can't present, clear numbers or exact figures quite yet. So we found a range of variation among these animals, which is in itself telling. It means that the physiology and trophic level of each species could be impacting how mercury is taken up. Different taxonomic groups had different amounts of mercury in them. Bats, for example, had higher values and primates had the smallest, which is also correlated inversely with weight. So the bats are the smallest animals we looked at, the primates are the largest, but actually all of these animals are pretty small. Even the biggest primate was only about 600 grams in weight. So the effective concentration at which birds, for example, show a certain percent of reduced nestling success has been established by prior studies. And you can see that here. There are birds in our data set that are showing ECs higher than 40% or more. Some bats are demonstrating high mercury levels, higher than anything previously reported in the region. And for primates, which are the most well-studied of the animals in our data set, we have 10 years on them, these demonstrate that females of reproductive age, or the primary breeding females, actually have the highest values. So what comes next? In early 2019, the Peruvian government launched Operation Mercury, which was an unprecedented crackdown on the rampant illegal gold mining in the region. The base map here on the left illustrates the results across 6 major gold mining fronts in southern Peruvian Amazon. Red indicates gold mining deforestation that was post-Operation Mercury, so March of 2019 to October 2020, but yellow indicates pre-operation baselines, January 2017 to February 2019, and you can see yellow is considerably higher than red. The MAAP project is the one that actually did this comparison, and they found that gold mining deforestation decreased about 90% in La Pampa following the Operation Mercury efforts. And they did find that some minor deforestation actually increased in certain surrounding areas. So miners were being sort of displaced and moving to new areas. But overall, this brought down deforestation by about 78% across all sites. But illegal mining does persist in this area. So in 2020, COVID prevented all screening of free-living wildlife in the region. But in 2021, we hope to resume this under a new umbrella. The In Situ Lab Initiative is a new collaborative program between 5 organizations: Washington University in St. Louis, the San Diego Zoo, the Amazon Conservation Association, the Asociación para la Conservación de la Cuenca Amazónica, and Field Projects International. Beginning in about 3 months, we will be redoing the surveillance on site as we did in 2018, getting a post-Operation Mercury timestamp. And we hope to add to this the screening of amphibians and reptiles as well, as these are the main predators of the bulk of the animals we typically screen. So that will fill in another gap in the food chain. We'll be establishing a laboratory facility in the Peruvian Amazon and developing and validating protocols for a variety of screening, including ecotoxicology monitoring in the context of mercury. So there's a lot to do in this region, but I want to end here giving some thanks to my team. I was going to also end with a figure on deforestation in the area and some pithy statement concerning this. But about 3 days ago, the region actually got the worst floods that it's ever seen since the 1960s. And a 60-day emergency has been declared in the Madre de Dios department. So I do want to highlight here also 4 organizations that you could help contribute to help the people in this region get through this really difficult period. And I am now going to stop sharing and can return this back to Ari.
Well, thank you, Merlini. Wow, I actually have a bunch of questions, but I'm sure the audience has a lot as well. I have a quick question for you. Were those fish-eating bats?
Yes.
Because you mentioned the bats had the highest
Yes.
mercury concentration.
Actually, within those, myotis were what we were seeing with the highest. They're 4-gram bats, but pretty high values.
Okay, that would explain because they're predatory fish predators.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any river otters in your research as well?
Not quite as yet directly with me, but the San Diego Zoo does have a really comprehensive program there. They're monitoring them, across a vast region, about 22 different oxbow lakes, I think. And so we're hoping to be able to bring that data in as well. And one of the ways we're going to do it is to actually have a mercury analyzer on site. And we're going to be working with the PicoUne, which is a small device, considerably easier to use, and it won an ASGM Conservation X Prize recently, so they're kind of collaborating with us to get that device to the Amazon. So hopefully we can get the river otter samples that have been collected so far also screened in the same way. Okay, wow, great. Well, I'm sure in the discussion, I think you'll probably get some more questions, so be prepared. Sure. Yeah, I will. And so I would like to invite our next speaker, Kelly Boyer-Onto, who will be traveling us to the continent of Africa for her talk.
Yes.
And the mic is yours, Kelly.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Are you seeing the screen that says sharing spaces?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'm glad everyone can hear me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thanks for attending. Thank you so much to the American Society of Primatology and the Conservation Committee for organizing this and for inviting me to attend and to present this research. As Mundolini has given a great introduction to small-scale gold mining, I am going to be continuing to talk about artisanal small-scale gold mining. But in this case, it's in a specific context in southeastern Senegal and the impacts on chimpanzees. So just to situate ourselves, chimpanzees live in East Central and West Africa. The laser pointer up here, if you can see this, I put a star here in southeastern Senegal, and that is where the field site, the Fongoli field site, where these data are coming from, and that's where I did this research at Dr. Jill Preetz's field site. So this is the northernmost part of the world where chimpanzees live. It's the hottest, it's the driest. It's a quite an intense place to live. And artisanal small-scale gold mining has a long history here in West Africa. So in this context, in much of the West African context, it's long been a seasonal form of gold mining. So people would spend most of their time doing agriculture, and then they'd spend the off season digging pits, panning for gold. And in this picture here, you can see how mining can be done in a forested environment without a whole lot of disruption, right? You can see where these piles of soil and rock and overburden has been dug up from individual pits that are dug by hand. There's an individual standing here in the image as well. And so they dig these pits, they bring up that, take out the overburden, that's what the hills of soil are, and then finally get down to the gold-bearing ore and bring that up and then crush that. And they do use mercury to separate the gold from the ore. But since the global recession, gold prices have increased, as was already mentioned, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here too. We've seen a massive increase of the small-scale mining in West Africa, and specifically in southeastern Senegal. And so in this image, you can see how the environment becomes largely bare soil as those hills of overburden basically coat the landscape, covering up any seed bank in the soil, so it reduces vegetation. And of course, there's deforestation to create the pits, but then also to cut down trees to help shore up the pits and shore up the mines. Here's another image of the specific area that I'll be looking at here at the Fongoli field site, known as the Ndundu mine. And you can see kind of the extent. When I say pits, sometimes they are individual kind of like person-sized pits, and often they are large trenches. And here in the foreground are those bags of the ore that has been brought up that needs to be crushed in order to search for the gold. So here, this is the field site, the Fongoli field site. The outer red area is the kind of the most extent of the range of the chimpanzees. That's like every location that they've been observed over a 10-year period, it was inside of this red area. So that's their home range. The blue area, if you can see that, that's a more specific where they spend most of their time. For those familiar with this, we call the red line the minimum convex polygon, and the blue line comes from a kernel density estimate, which just indicates more intensive use in that area. The area here that I've circled in black, and you can see all these little red diamonds. Each of the red diamonds are sites where artisanal small-scale gold mining took place within this 10-year study period. And I'm focusing in on this black circle, which is known as the Ndundu mine, the image I just showed. To give you a little more information about the chimpanzees and the study, it looks at the Fongoli chimpanzee community from 2005 through 2014. And the group includes on average about 32 individuals, about 10 adult males, 7 adult females. And the study was done, it's a long-term field site, it's continuous research of individual male focal follows. So the males are individual males followed by a researcher and observer who then records their location, the vegetation type that they're in, the behavior that they're doing at these 5-minute interval observations. So this is a lot of data here for over the course of 10 years. And to identify where the gold mining sites are that I showed you in the previous image in that map, that was information that partially came from observations as field researchers would write down, they'd write down the information about what was at the site when the chimpanzees were there. But we also did satellite imagery and delineated the areas of bare ground using satellite imagery and GIS, as well as interviewing people about when the mine started. So here's a similar image of the change in gold prices, but I focus it here on the study period. So starting in 2005 through 2014. Now, 2008 through 2010, as we mentioned, is this time period of the global recession. And that's when we see gold mining really take off. So we called the time period between 2005 and 2007 pre-mining. There was still some low-level mining. As I mentioned, there's always been seasonal mining, but the intensive mining at the Ndundu mine doesn't start until 2008 to 2011. From 11 to 12, as prices skyrocket here, we see an increase, a massive increase in mining at the Ndundu site. And what I'm calling the late period mining is late with reference to the study period. And this is the time when the mine is the most extensive, the largest footprint, and the largest number of people going to the mine. So my questions here have been, how has mining influenced how chimpanzees use their habitat? And I'm specifically interested in how mining activities, my hypotheses here, I should say, are that mining activity reduces the frequency of chimpanzee use in the mined areas. And my other hypothesis is that we'd see the presence of miners reduce the frequency of chimpanzee use. And this is related to the fact that we know that sometimes that there's a regular schedule of mining where they have 2 days off and 5 days on of working. So to think about that first question, I decided to look at the mined area. So delineating the mined area at the Ndundu mine based on the area of bare soil, and then giving it about a 10-meter buffer around it. So that includes some forested areas, some savanna areas. So all that is what I'm defining as the Ndundu mine. And then I broke it into those time periods. So if I looked at, were chimpanzees using the mine prior to the start of the increase of mining in that early mining period, 2008 to 2010, what's very interesting is that the observations of chimpanzee use, there were actually no observations of chimpanzees using that area from 2005 up until 2008. It was in 2008, 9, and 10, when the mining started, that we actually see an increase in chimpanzee use in the bare dirt mine area, that anthropic zone where people work. Is in blue here. They also use the adjacent forests and the adjacent savannas. As we go into expanded mining, we also see a similar trend where they weren't using it very often prior to that expanded footprint of the mine from 2011 and 12. But once it expands, they do increase their use of it. And then by the late mining, when we have the maximum extent of the mine and the most people using the mine, this is when we see use of the mining area by the chimpanzees decrease and go almost to nothing. Now, the second hypothesis was about whether or not the presence of miners reduces the frequency of chimpanzee use. And in this case, I'm looking at different, by the different types of landscapes again. So we've got the bare dirt mine, followed by forests environments and then savanna environments. If we looked at, so here, I actually took out the data of the observed just to highlight here that the expected data is that we would expect 2/7, right? 2 days out of the week that if the chimpanzees were using it, they would use it on the day off. And if it was used the same amount on when they worked there, we would see this amount of use on their days on. But what we actually see is only 100% of the chimpanzee use of the bare dirt anthropic zone where people physically mine. Chimpanzees only use it when people aren't there on their days off. When we look at the savanna areas, we see a similar trend. They're using it during the days off and using it only sometimes when the people are there. And interestingly enough, when we go to the forest, we see no difference between the observed and what we'd expect with no difference. So the chimpanzees are using the forested environment alongside of the mines at equal frequencies, whether people are there or they're not there. So here's a couple images to show how the chimpanzees will use the mines. They will sometimes drink water out of the holes that have been created because water is needed to help excavate the mines and get the ore out. So people will actually dig water sources, which in a very dry environment, you can see the benefit there, but the perceived benefit. And you can also see an image here of chimpanzees walking through a mined area where they are abandoned holes in the ground. So just to kind of recap here, my hypothesis that mining activity reduces the frequency of chimpanzee use is not fully supported. Chimpanzee use of the mine seemed to increase as mining increased until we got to the late mining period. And for the presence of miners, reducing frequency of chimpanzee use, this does seem to be supported. But interestingly enough, the habitat type also plays a role. So it's true for those anthropic, bare ground mined areas and the savanna areas, but not for forested areas. So just to conclude here, we see that despite a small footprint associated with artisanal and small-scale gold mining, behavior does get impacted. And that while gold mining itself may not be a deterrent, there may be some threshold of tolerance to the mining activity, which should be investigated further. And then lastly, attraction to the mining areas remains a bit of a mystery. Why would they go towards the mines? And it may be due to some sort of learning, direct observational learning, maybe identifying novel risks. But unfortunately, there's a number of risks associated with mines that are not going to be perceived easily, like contaminated water sources that they're drinking from, or open and hidden mine shafts that they could fall into, or the lack of sanitation around a mine and open fecal deposits around. So there's a number of risks that also, again, need more areas of study. So with that, I'd just like to thank everybody who's contributed to the project. This was part of my dissertation work, so I have a number of people to thank. My email's there if anyone does want to contact me or have any other questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. Wow, very interesting. I actually have a couple of quick questions.
Yeah.
Was there any contact between the chimps and the miners at some point?
So we don't have any evidence of like direct contact. We see in part of the study that we've looked at has been looking at increased visual encounters and increased vocal encounters between chimpanzees and the people in the environment. We saw that there has been an increase of encounters between chimpanzees and miners, at least visually, over the 10-year period, where it used to be mostly people collecting forest resources like fruits and things like that. And there's been a shift into more miners in the environment.
So it seems like, I guess, both species are tolerant of each other to some extent.
You know, to some extent, the human chimpanzee encounters did increase over the 10-year period. And there was some evidence that the chimpanzees' responses were getting to be showing more signs of aggression. So there is a risk that we're going to have an increased risk of the human chimpanzee conflict. At this point, or for a long time, the human chimpanzee relationship at Fongoli and other places in southeastern Senegal has been good, has been very good.
Mm-hmm.
But we are concerned, the more miners, people coming from other countries that are more likely to engage in bushmeat hunting, especially of chimpanzees, there could be more risks.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here.
There might be more questions later on. So thank you to the first two speakers. And I will share my screen. So for my talk, we will be traveling back to the continent of South America. As Bert mentioned in his introduction, I am from Suriname. I currently live in Suriname, live and work in Suriname. And I am part of a large-scale environmental health study. And so I will be highlighting some of that research. I have a little disclaimer. So since most of that data, we have collected a lot of data, but we have not published yet. So I will give you some data, but I cannot give all the data. Hopefully later this year, we will have more publications and then we can be more communicative about the data. So the title of my talk is Human and Biodiversity Health in the Age of Mining. And I will be highlighting an integrative approach. I'm sure you've all heard of the One Health approach. So this is very similar to that. And if you're not familiar with the One Health approach, it is the approach that recognizes the health of the environment, and that of plants and animals is directly related to our own health. And so within that context, I will give you a visual aid on where in the world this is. So if you know South America and have heard of the Amazon, there is a part we call the Guyana Shield. It is in the northeastern portion of the continent. So on this image taken from Berardi et al. 2015, here are the countries in the Guyana Shield without their borders. But you see the border of the Guyana Shield, which is one of the oldest geological formations in the world. And you see it encompasses parts of Venezuela, parts of Colombia, parts of Brazil, and the three countries, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, are completely part of the Guyana Shield. You see as well, it has numerous rivers, it's an expansive river system, all part of the Amazon, but the rivers in Guyana and Suriname and French Guiana, many of them, however, are not connected directly to the Amazon. And so what makes this part of the world so unique or important? It is a vast expanse of tropical habitat. As you see there, it's 2.7 million square kilometers large, thousands of plant species, about 4,000 vertebrate species, and I'm sure many more thousand species of insects, of amphibians, and reptiles. And because of the vast river system in the Guyana Shield, it is also home to 10 to 15% of the world's freshwater resources. It has an annual discharge of about 2,792 cubic kilometers of water. And besides being home to high biodiversity of plants and animals, the Guyana Shield is also home to many indigenous peoples. And this is a relatively older map from National Geographic. I'll zoom in a little bit on the Guyana Shield. But as you can see, if you can sort of remember that the Guyana Shield is around this region, you can see a couple of indigenous nations mentioned in the different countries. These are some of them. I mean, these are the major indigenous nations found in the Guyana Shield and the Amazon, but there are many more smaller groups and communities, some we do not know of and some we know of. And many of them live along the rivers in the Guyana Shield. And I'll come back to that because that is a very important thing to keep in mind. And so since we're talking about mining, I'll stick to gold mining in this region. And I'll focus on these three countries particularly because Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana, once again, are completely in the Guyana Shield. And the green highlighted regions here are what is called the Greenstone Belt. That is where the ore, the gold ore, is located. And you see here in Suriname, it's mostly to the east, the green pattern, some in the center, and a little bit to the west. Whereas Guyana, it's more a north-south direction, and French Guiana has quite a bit of gold ore deposits. And why is this important? Here is a map of Suriname. And so now focusing on our country, Brazil in the south, French Guiana in the east, and Guyana in the west, Atlantic Ocean in the north. Let me zoom in a little bit. So what you see here is a map of the country, and all those little red dots, those are communities, villages of both indigenous peoples and tribal peoples. Tribal peoples is what we define as the descendants of what is historically known as the runaway slaves. So Suriname was previously a Dutch colony, and I'm sure you know the Dutch were slave traders. And so we, in this part of South America, a lot of slaves were transported from the western part of Africa to the region. And during the period of slavery, many of them fled the plantations where they met the indigenous people who took them up as their brothers and sisters, and ever since have lived together in harmony. And so all of these villages are both indigenous and tribal people. And as I mentioned earlier, you notice they're all situated along major rivers. And I mean, historically, it's always been like that for transportation, but primarily for food. Because for many of these communities, consuming fish is the primary source of protein. So keep that in mind. And the highlighted yellow regions here in the eastern portion of the country, around this is a man-made lake. Those are gold mining areas. Both Merlini and Kelly spoke of mining. And so this is both ASGM activity, so small scale gold mining, but also large scale gold mining. And just to give you an idea of what it is like in the field with the small scale gold mining, if you work in this area or know of mining, this should be a familiar image to you. So without going into depth about the entire process of gold mining, it is evident from these pictures the destruction to terrestrial and aquatic habitats. And terrestrial, I mean, they remove the topsoil of the rainforest, which is probably the most fertile part of the rainforest. There's deforestation, there's erosion, there's contamination of waterways, not just from mercury, but sedimentation from the mining activity itself. And so based on that, for my master's degree, I actually wanted to research if wild monkeys actually have, if there's an impact on wild monkeys when it comes to gold mining. And so I did my research at a national park in Suriname, which is heavily mined around the park. And what I primarily did was I collected fecal and urine samples from wild monkeys, and I compared them to samples from lab monkeys in the United States and monkeys at a local zoo in Suriname. So these 8 species are the ones we find in Suriname. And so I developed a method to process the urine and the fecal samples. It was done in the field primarily. And just to give a quick overview, this is both fecal and urine samples. And the dotted line is what we call the body burden level, which is at that concentration of mercury, the body is at burden to be excreting it. And a number of samples you see are beneath the body burden, but there are a couple of samples very much above the body burden level. And so while this is not alarming, it is alarming in the fact that, as we can see, there is some toxicity of mercury in these wild primates. And so at some point in time, I ventured further in my research, and of course, I've ventured into the domain of public health, because obviously, for the indigenous peoples in Suriname that depend on fish as a primary source of protein, there can be serious consequences. We know from other studies around the world that especially pregnant women or expecting mothers have high risk of toxicity, of getting mercury in their system due to eating fish. But we also know fish is important for the development of the fetus. And there have been many other research projects in Suriname looking at mercury contamination. And I just want to highlight one briefly. So this is part of a paper from Dr. Paul Alboter, who's done more than a decade of research on mercury contamination in Suriname. But what I want to highlight here is he looked at total mercury content in sediment. Right is total mercury content in predatory fish. The green is the greenstone belt, where primarily all the gold mining takes place. And the gray bars to the right of each location, those are the standards, either the EU or the WHO standards for tolerable amount of mercury to be present in that organism. And so for sediment, you see a lot of locations, bars are quite higher than the norm or what should be expected. And in the predatory fish is the same story. Many of the bars to the left have higher mercury content than what is tolerable for human consumption. And what is disturbing, or something we really need to think about, is that both fish and sediment in non-mining areas also have high mercury concentration levels. And once again, this relates back to human health, because all the communities are situated along the rivers, whereby many of these communities are very much dependent still on fish as a protein source. And so to come back to my current work, I am part of a grand study that's been taking place for the past 4 to 5 years already. It is called CREO. It stands for the Caribbean Consortium for Research in Environmental and Occupational Health in Suriname. In our local language, it's called Miki Tamara, which roughly translated, it means make tomorrow or make a better tomorrow. It is a environmental epidemiologic prospective cohort study. And what it basically means is we follow 1,000 mother-child dyads. And what it comes down to is we address the question of mercury exposure in these mother-child dyads, but also exposure to pesticides. But that's from agricultural practices. And we've collected hair samples from these women. We've collected blood samples. We've also collected urine samples. Most of that data is still being analyzed. Some of it is already published. Some preliminary data was already published, and I can show you what that looks like. And so for some of the villages we sampled, this is from a paper. I think this is 2018. Oh yeah, I have the reference there on the bottom. And so these are 5 villages that where women were sampled, hair samples were collected, and where it was analyzed for hair mercury. And the US EPA action level of is indicated in the chart over there. And as you see, quite a lot of these women, with the exception of Brunswick, which is very interesting. I'll come back to that in a bit. The 4 other villages have, on average, quite an elevated amount of hair mercury. And so Brunswick, which is actually right by the small-scale gold mining, in Dr. Aboder's previous work, they did food surveys, dietary surveys of those people at Brunswick. And a lot of them no longer eat fish. And because they have access to supermarkets and the freezer section, they actually have switched their diet to eating chicken attained from the supermarket. Whereas the other villages there, many of them still rely on fish. So basically, it's a confirmation that these women are at a very high risk of mercury toxicity, which in turn has an effect on the developing fetus. So in summary, what do we know so far? We know that the women in the interior of Suriname have elevated hair mercury levels, and we did compare it to urban and rural areas in Suriname. So compared to those areas, there are elevated hair mercury levels. From fish and sediment analysis, it's confirmed that fish are indeed, I would say infested, but there's high elevated mercury levels in fish. There are two publications, recent publications from my colleagues, one from Baldo Singh and Gokul. And so Baldo Singh looked at preterm birth rate in indigenous women in Suriname and found is that they had a interestingly high birth rate compared to low income countries and high income countries. And so this is something to look at. And I mean, I personally think it's something to really look into and worry about, because why is there such a high rate of preterm birth rate amongst indigenous women in Suriname? And so Gokul found a possible correlation between women in Suriname that have elevated hair mercury levels and preterm birth. And so there, just to be on the safe side, there could be indeed the correlation of the presence of mercury in the environment, it making its way into women and children, which has an effect on the preterm birth. And as I showed previously, there is some contamination in non-human primates. And so what is happening now? Suriname signed the Minamata Convention. It was ratified by Parliament. And so we have a lot of international organizations assisting Suriname in finding alternatives. There's a lot of cooperation between universities in the US and Suriname and with the National Institute of Health. Of course, all the local organizations in Suriname that I'm also part of, and the university especially. But what is most important is that this is the logo of an activist, an environmental activist organization who is trying to educate and make people aware of the issue at hand with mercury and the environment. And last, but certainly not least, the indigenous people, the indigenous organizations are actively involved in educating women and children in finding alternatives to fish. So we are working with them in creating educational material to provide names and listings of fish that are have less mercury content. And these materials at least will be then distributed to the communities. And with that, I would like to thank you all. And we will go over to the discussion, and I will keep this up and hand it over to Bert. Thank you.
Thanks, Ari. That was a fascinating presentation. I'm going to start off by asking a question here. Not a question, make an observation. I think the name "Make a Better Tomorrow" is just a wonderful phrase. And certainly with the high rate of preterm births associated with mercury in the hair, there's challenges for making that better tomorrow. So I wish you and your team the best of luck on these efforts.
Yes, thank you, Bert. Yeah, which is, I think, why the term was coined, because we realize it's a challenge, and we're very hopeful that we can meet that challenge and find good solutions.
Well, great, thank you. So some questions have come in, so I'm going to go ahead and pose questions to our speakers. I'm going to start off with a question for Mundolini from Lei Kai Zwan. Why do you specifically choose to test the mercury level from the hair and feathers instead of other body parts?
So this is a really great question. And it's basically because those are two non-invasively, relatively speaking, proxies that we can obtain. And so there have been fair amounts of studies in the past that looked at a variety of body parts in animals, but those would have to be from animals that have died, right? And so when you're doing a wildlife study and you want to make sure that the animals you're working with are going to be fine after you've worked with them, you want to take the least invasive thing you can. So we are also working with very small animals. And so when we do get a blood sample, that is a highly coveted sample. And so it goes towards a lot of disease screening and genomics-based work as well. And so we've been thinking about the hair and the feathers as the types of tissue that will record the exposure of mercury that the animal has had over time, because as hair grows, it kind of keeps that record in there. And so there's a lot of question for sure about how often they molt, and whether you're getting a young feather or an old feather, for example, things like that, that can affect things. But right now, the idea is to take something that the animal won't miss, and that has been verified to have levels that we can detect.
Thank you. Thank you. So here's a question for Kelly. Might there be food remains for the miners that the chimps might be looking for?
That is a great question too. And, trying to keep my talk to 8 to 10 minutes, which I don't know if I did, kind of streamlined the talk, but that, trying to figure out why they go to those mines or why they started going to that mining site was really an interesting question. We don't have any evidence. There's no observations of chimpanzees accessing any food remains that were at the sites. What we have observed were them inspecting things. So if somebody left a bag or like plastic bowls, the chimpanzees would sometimes go and like sniff them. They didn't really engage with them too much. They didn't like carry them around or anything, but they'd sniff them and kind of inspect them before moving on. But no evidence that any food remains were left, no.
Great. And so the other question, would food or other objects left over by miners be causing the chimpanzees to approach mines? You were addressing that question, I think, also to a certain extent.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, the one question is about water is a good question. And the image that was shown in my talk is actually taken it wasn't actually from the Ndundu mine where I focused this talk on. It was a different water source in the Fongoli area where some other mining was happening. So when we think specifically about the Ndundu mine, we didn't see these open water sources that chimpanzees were accessing more than their other natural water sources. So that also, food, water, those are going to be the big things. And we just didn't see evidence that there was enough to attract them there or that they were engaging in drinking or eating at those sites.
Great, thanks. Now, here's a question to all panelists. Do you think that mercury capture systems could be part of the solution to reducing mercury aerosols and contamination?
I think so. I can answer really quickly here. I think there have been some systems that have been trialed in the Peruvian Amazon. And so the way that this works is, when mercury binds to gold, it forms a sort of nugget that it's called DOR, and it is something that needs to be incinerated for the mercury to be evaporated off so that you are left with just the purest gold that you can get. That's then weighed, and that is how a miner is paid for what they're able to mine. And so I've actually walked into stores where I'm there to say exchange currency, for example, but there's somebody standing behind a computer screen, and people in line ahead of me will hand over the DOR. It's put into a little incinerator right next to you, right there on the counter, and someone just uses a blowtorch and lights it up. And you're 3 people behind. And like, I was so taken aback when I saw this, but there's a sort of a funnel shaped filter that can be placed over this. And so there've been quite a few improvements on that system that can actually capture and potentially reuse the mercury, so that people are not tempted to actually light it up, closer to where they're mining things, and potentially just bring it in or use that system instead.
I would like to add something real quick to that. So indeed, just like Mundolini explained, so there are capture systems, and I know it has been, there were trials with it in Suriname with a bunch of miners, and for some reason it was not very successful, either from just reluctance from the miners to be using an alternative method or another process, another chain in their process, which is more time, maybe more money they need to invest in such a capturing device. And so it works, but sometimes it doesn't catch on with the miners, which is sometimes more of the issue than the actual capturing device itself.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to make an announcement before I come back to some more questions. It is 5 p.m. and I know that people have other things to attend to possibly, but we do have 30 more minutes for additional questions that I'll return to here in a second. I do want to remind you all that the American Society of Primatology's Conservation Committee are hosting this event and really appreciate your generosity in supporting our efforts to fund primate research, and really pleased with the number of participants today. So again, thank you for all attending. And back to questions here. So this is a question for Mundolini. Do you think that the natural disaster of a couple of days ago increased the amount of mercury in the trees in the area and have more serious numbers in the following years?
So this is a disaster coming right on the heels of Operation Mercury, which actually reduced a lot of mining capacity in the area. So just based on that, I'd say possibly no. But if you're just thinking about it functionally, when mercury is burnt off from the door, it can go into the air and it settles in and around that area. It's on the leaves of trees. And when it rains, that does get washed off and brought down. It's called throughfall that you can actually measure. And so you can get that in soil and in runoff. And I'm imagining that a lot of also mines that rest on the edges of these main rivers are entirely inundated. And so any mercury that was in that environment is now in the water. I would imagine it is moving great distances quite quickly, rather, as opposed to what it might normally have taken to move those distances. And so it's a bit of a complicated, long-winded response, but I think that's basically my best guess at this. I don't know about following years. My feeling is that we're going to see overall with the wildlife potentially a drop because we've tested them in 2018 and now we're almost 3 years later. So, we might see lower numbers. It would be explained by the pandemic and Operation Mercury at the same time.
Thank you. And I think this could be a question for Ari. Is there research about fish-eating bats in the Guianas?
Yes, there is actual research, but I don't know specifically on like mercury in hair or organs of bats. But definitely, I mean, there are many. I can at least think of one person who probably has done a lot of research on fish-eating bats in Guyana itself, but not on. I'm not sure on mercury, but definitely on the ecology and the biology of bats itself.
Would it be possible to evaluate mercury levels in museum collection specimens through time, or when specimens are preserved, does that impact the ability to measure mercury in hair?
I would think so, because the preservation process itself involves chemicals and some kind of drying of the tissue, or like dehydration of the tissue to make it be preserved.
Sure.
And yeah, I wouldn't know the specific chemical reactions, but I'm pretty sure it might impact the levels of mercury measured when it's preserved.
And I'll just kind of add something, if I may, and I please, Ari and Mundolini, follow up on this, and if I'm not correct on this on the most recent research, but to my understanding that there's not that much research on terrestrial mammals and mercury bioaccumulation. There's a lot of research on fish, and then also with humans eating the fish, but actual looking at how much mercury is getting into terrestrial mammals there's a dearth of information. This is an area that really needs a lot more work, and particularly with primates, I would say.
Absolutely. And one of the things also to meld that with the idea of looking at museum specimens is that when we're doing this, because mercury moves by rivers so far, it's actually really hard to find a control site, a site that has not been, touched by mercury. And so sometimes museum specimens, even with the degradation, are probably your best bet at being able to get some sort of sense of a pre-mining, world. And so that's why I think they might get used.
Great. Here's another question, and what alternative sources of work, money have you seen that could potentially replace gold mining? So I guess I could go to any of you or all of you.
Maybe I'll start off. I think it depends on, the country and the situation. It's very tricky, at least in Suriname, because these places are very remote in the sense that, it's in the rainforest. Sometimes it's quite a distance from the actual community where they live, these people. And it's not always locals. It could also be, in our case, many Brazilians enter Suriname to take part in the gold mining. So yeah, what kind of alternative do you present to them? I'm not quite sure. The thing is, where there's mining, there pops up other industries. As you know, I mean, there's prostitution, there's trading in labor, human trafficking, there's weapons trafficking, drug trafficking. So I'm not sure, at least for Suriname, if it's like an easy thing to pinpoint, like maybe go to logging. But then again, logging might not be the alternative, because that also could be destructive in a certain way if it's not done properly.
Excellent answer, Ari, and it really shows the complexity of these situations and also the potential interrelatedness of activities that can cause harm to the environment and also to serious illegal activities in terms of armed trade and human trafficking. Kelly?
I would also add this, that that part of it is also interesting. It's also interesting to think about the psychology of mining, that there's random reinforcement that happens, and you can watch your neighbor strike it rich. I mean, like in a day, they can just suddenly have massive amounts of money. And it's very hard to tell people, like, you shouldn't do this because you're probably not going to strike it rich. I mean, people gamble all around the world because of this random reinforcement that someday you might make it. You might be the person that strikes it rich. And, people are making money off of it, and they're making tangible money off of it. That does improve their access to resources. So while it doesn't answer the question, what are other livelihoods? What are other things people can be doing? Because in these rural areas, in these remote places, it is lucrative, and there is always this possibility of really getting rich off of it, which I think is very attractive to people.
And Kelly, that's a really interesting answer too, that in Colorado, that there's a heyday of gold and silver mining past us. But over the past few years, there have been a whole a renewed interest in reopening mines. And of course, it's driven by looking for that big payday. And it's also associated with ongoing environmental degradation and pollution. So we don't have to leave the United States to see these challenges. Here's another question to all speakers. Any signs of depressed population densities where mining is going on? Also, have you ever seen any deformed, says monkeys here, but also deformed chimpanzees?
I have a small comparison to the previous question, if I could step in real quick. But there's such a difference between the way, Kelly, you were presenting what's going on in Senegal and Peru, because in Peru, there isn't a randomness to it, really. There's gold everywhere. So gold is invisible. It's in the sediment and soil. You're not looking for a nugget. You're not looking for a vein. It is wherever sediments deposit. So in oxbow lakes or at the bottom of rivers. And so people do, however, still find it extremely lucrative. So you can make $300 a day, selling gold in just a single day of mining. You can, you also see, therefore, that it's not really, when you think about indigenous people there, they are vastly overshadowed by people that have moved in the last 10 years or so. So at one point, about 700 new people were moving into Puerto Maldonado, which is the main city in that region, per day. I mean, this was huge. So huge migrations have happened, and a lot of these industries that build up around that as well. So You can find, though, in terms of thinking about the psychology of this, that, I think when you look at it from the outside, it's very easy to coat things with a sort of, this is right and this is wrong kind of, black and white brush. And that it's surprising to us to think of a single family who might have children who are in school for agroforestry degrees, who are aiming to be ecotourists, like guides, but who have also done mining in their past. I mean, it is all part of like one thing, right? And so it's not a yes, no thing, but I will say that the bulk of it is a very hard life. You are living next to a generator that's running 24 hours a day, and most of the miners are therefore deaf. They do not get paid by, if they're working for others, by companies to get meat, so they have to do bushmeat hunting to subsist off of that. And so it is not, and they're not from the forest. So there isn't an intrinsic sort of respect or knowledge about how to live there. It is a very sort of man versus wild thing that can happen for the people that come in from the outside. And so it's quite interesting how different it is between the different states. And as for deformed monkeys, my counter question to that would be, we really don't know what the rate of deformed monkeys are in normal situations. And so if you think of preterm births, that could be happening very easily. And I only see an infant, which is, a 15 grams sitting on the back of a tamarin, for example, when it's several weeks old, usually for the first time. And so if there isn't one, or we may just miss these things. But we are recording over time reproductive output, and so hopefully we'll be able to see this over time. But again, where's your control, right? So that's the really hard part here.
Thank you.
And in terms of chimpanzees, since it was listed in the question, yeah, I would agree that. So there's very few habituated chimpanzee groups in West Africa. In Senegal, there's the Fongoli site. There's a new site at Sirek that's working on habituation. The sites that I've been working on more recently, they're not habituated. So I that kind of data, the rates and we don't know that information. And I don't believe there's any, again, with this a question of preterm births, or even like things like the risks of abortions, or from it, we might be able to track that in humans, but we're not able to track that in wild primates. I mean, there are other questions. I'm kind of curious looking forward about, are there ways to kind of measure, body fat or body weight, or, there's other correlations that we might be able to get to, but for me at this site, it's early to get anywhere with that. And plus, I'm trying to do this with camera traps. So there's a lot of barriers to trying to get that information.
Yes, I think Mundolini's, your site and your project, I mean, I'm amazed by the width of your data and how many taxa you have. And I'm curious, once you are allowed to publish or, present the data, what it's like, because that's the kind of information we need. It's what is happening in the ecosystem. Because, sometimes we try to focus on the taxa that we like. I mean, we like monkeys, but it's more than that. It's the entire ecosystem. There's something happening, and we just don't know all the information yet.
Yeah, I'm very excited. By the end of the year, hopefully, I should be able to have that second data point analyzed and the comparison ready anyway.
And this sort of question, any signs of depressed population densities where mining is going on, it's a great question, but it also speaks to the reality that we often lack baseline data on these sorts of things, so that we can anticipate. I personally would anticipate there are depressed population densities where mining is going on, but that's something I anticipate or suspect versus something that can be documented.
I mean, sheer levels of forests are disappearing. So, I mean, just the fact that there isn't any habitat left, you would expect there to be a corresponding sort of drop in the numbers if you're looking over those scales. But otherwise it's I don't see at the site that I've been working at for the last 10 years, I don't think we're having lower birth rates. And it's a very sort of tricky thing. It's actually very hard to convince anybody that mercury is bad for them, because the effects are, it's a neurotoxin, it's cognitive decline of your children. It's, things like that that seem very distant from the actual, metal. And when you used it, and so it's a hard, people aren't dropping dead. They're not going through like Minamata disease levels of toxicity. It's something less than that. It's just pervasive, and it's very hard to convince people that that something is wrong, that this is bad for you. And so I don't know how, in wildlife, it's even harder to measure that.
Can I just add something real quick to that? So yes, because methylmercury, it's a neurotoxin, but it takes such a long time to really see anything, any effect. And that's what makes people think, oh, it's fine. I mean, we don't have deformed babies, or, our kids are still smart. But in 10, 15, 20 years, we've noticed actually in Suriname, in general, there's an increase in dialysis, renal issues. And for the physiologists among us, mercury is excreted through the renal system, through your urine. And I don't know, maybe there might be a correlation there. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud. Is the high toxicity, is it stressing the organs, and maybe at some point in time that person will be under dialysis, but no one will really think about, oh, what were they eating? Like, was there mercury in the fish? It'll just be, diagnosed as some renal failure. But that's like 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, it's both fascinating and terrifying. Before we finish up here, I just want to make a couple of announcements. There is 2 upcoming webinars: Bridging Primate Habitats on the 25th of March, and Hunting Wildlife Markets of Food Security on the 8th of April. And I'm hoping that both of these webinars will be as interesting as today's has been. And also, again, just a reminder that if you can, please support our primate conservation efforts. Go to the American Society of Primatology website and make a donation. And before I thank our panelists once again, I just can't help but go back to part of the introduction for Ari, that this viewpoint that we need to respect nature, revere all that nature provides, and be responsible citizens in nature. That when we think about the cascade effects of mercury poisoning, for example, that there's so many things that we'll never be able to know, but it's hard to anticipate good from any of this. So that, again, this notion of respect, of taking care of the world we live in. So again, thank you all. Just a wonderful series of presentations. And I know that for the remainder of the day, I'm going to be thinking about mercury pollution. So that, again, thank you all.
Thanks very much for the chance to do this.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for everyone attending and for organizing.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see you with the next seminar.
That's right.
Yeah, looking forward to seeing you all on March 25th.
Sounds good. Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.